The purpose of this video is to present possible evidence empirically for the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model's embowed zetetic surface underneath the dome. In Zeteticism Volume 1, I discussed the embowed surface. In Zeteticism Volume 5, I gave very specific evidence for it, in addition to evidence given in Zeteticism Volume 1. This brief video also will give evidence for the embowed zetetic surface. The idea is that the flat plane is not in fact perfectly flat, but does have an arc to it, which can therefore explain the reason for the sun setting, among other things as discussed in Zeteticisms Volume 1 through 5. Specifically in Volume 1, it was discussed how planes lose altitude regularly, routinely, and it's a standard issue with jetliners or planes that are flying much lower to lose altitude while they're flying. Of course, this is in perfect agreement with the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model, because if there's an arc to the zetetic surface, then if a plane takes off from a certain location and flies in a direction, it will actually be flying with its nose pointed down into the ground because of the arc of the zetetic plane surface of Earth. There's a theoretical explanation given for it, in that cold temperatures make planes lose altitude. I have been and will continue to look for the very specific, ironclad empirical evidence for this claim and why this is the case. But up to this point, I of course have not found it. And the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model would make the prediction that it is not the case, and that the reason for the altitude loss is this arced zetetic surface, as just discussed. So the point in this video is to bring up something very interesting that I've noticed throughout my life since I was a child flying on jetliners. And that is, often when I'm in a jetliner, I will see running water flowing across the windows. We are told that in the troposphere, and particularly the tropopause at the edge of the stratosphere where jetliners fly, is anywhere from -40 to over -100 degrees Fahrenheit, or -45 to -75 Celsius, with an unfathomable wind chill of a plane going 500 miles an hour. So we are talking about incredibly cold temperatures, and it's purely astonishing, as you're seeing in your screen here from video I took on a recent plane flight that I was on, how there can be liquid water flowing across a jetliner's window. You'll see here in this video I'm flying over the Rocky Mountains, so I'm significantly high in the air, going over one of the higher parts of the United States as far as land altitude goes. So the reason this is significant is because this would appear to reveal that there is no such cold atmosphere high above us. This is mysterious because we all know when we go to the top of a mountain, or when we look at mountains from below, we can see that they're colder, such as there'll be snow on them when it only rained down in the valley, and we can travel up the mountain and we can feel it get colder. So it must be the case that there's just a ring of cold air around the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope, and it actually gets warmer above that. And in fact, it must be significantly warmer. And I wonder, even to the point of being hot air, for all that wind chill of a plane going 500 miles an hour, for there still to be water that is not frozen on the plane, reveals a very warm atmosphere that the plane is traveling through. This would completely obliterate the theoretical idea that the cold atmosphere is the reason for planes losing their altitude, and this would be evidence for the reason planes are losing their altitude is because of the embowed zetetic surface of our Zetetic Eye Gyroscope reality that we may live in if the model is correct. According to atmospheric science, it is the upper troposphere where planes are flying, 30 to 40,000 feet. It is claimed by professional academic meteorology that the upper troposphere is very cold, but of course we are saying here in this video the evidence is that the upper troposphere is very warm, which would be specific evidence for the embowed zetetic surface. It is important to note that the temperature descriptions and layers of atmosphere given in professional meteorology and atmospheric science are theoretical, since we cannot verify them, but the idea that the upper troposphere is very warm can be verified by any of us who get in a plane and see the running water across jetliner windows, as I've seen many times in my life and as you're seeing in your screen right here. Typically we are told what happens is, as we can all verify, if we go to the top of a room we're in to change a light bulb, we can feel heat bunching up at the top of the room, and the room is warmer at the ceiling than it is at the floor. So then we might think that hot air is rising, but if we walk outside and look at the mountain, we see that it's colder since we can see snow on top of it. And as you're seeing in your screen now, there are theoretical explanations for why this happens that come from mainstream academia. In mainstream academia, with the heliocentric model in Big Bang cosmology, will hold the position that the temperature will keep dropping once one goes further up to the mountains. Please note that these are all theoretical explanations, since they do not offer direct empirical information, direct empirical evidence for these temperatures. However, just as the running water on the airplane window shows that the atmosphere above the mountains is very warm, not even cold enough to freeze the water as the plane travels 500 miles an hour through supposedly very cold air, which should certainly freeze it and form great condensation on the windows of the airplane inside the cabin. Furthermore, there are many stories of plane windows breaking during flight, holes forming in airplanes as they're flying, where never is it reported, except in one incident, that there's any cold air rushing in through the window. Almost always what is discussed is how heroic the pilots were, how grateful not more people were hurt, how great of a job the passengers did during the tragedy and the emergency situation, and so forth. The troposphere is not the temperatures we're told by mainstream academia. And that what is happening is, while you can travel from the surface of the earth at sea level and experience the earth getting colder as you travel up into the mountains, and you can directly verify the lowering temperature, it is, however, the case that when one goes higher than that, such as in a jetliner, that the temperature then again starts to increase at some point and gets quite warm, to such a degree that incidents where planes have had windows blow out at 32,000 feet, for example, cold air is not reported to come rushing into the plane. Not only is this disastrous information for the heliocentric model of a spherical Earth, and which would seemingly be disastrous enough to destroy the entire model completely, it is also extremely robust empirical evidence for the specific zetetic model I've invented, called the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model. Since now there is no explanation for why airplanes lose their altitude during flight other than the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model, which involves the flat Earth plane having an embowment, so therefore the nose of the plane is always pointed slightly into the ground, and it is expected to lose altitude, as discussed in Zeteticism Volume 1 in detail. Well-known jetliner incidents where holes in the plane or windows blown out mid-flight occur. A couple examples we're going to go over here, but nobody reports any cold air, and video shows nobody cold in any way. This first one, man sucked out of plane in midair, February 2, 2016. So this is in Africa, only about 10,000 feet up. So I'm not sure how cold the air would be. Definitely colder than the ground according to the standard view. But this is at mountain level, 10,000 feet. So one would assume it would be somewhat colder but quite bearable. So this is not a story that I will focus on. Moving to the next one. Here we have the well-known case from April 2018 of the Albuquerque woman who was sucked out of a plane halfway but pulled back in and was unfortunately killed. You can see that it's April, so it's not going to be exactly warm where this happened in the northern part of the United States. And it was at 32,000 feet. So it's in the level of the purported extreme troposphere temperatures. You can see in the picture here, people have coats on and they're not dressed like it's summer. So it would appear to be safe to say that the extremely cold troposphere temperatures would be in place. But if one reads news stories, there is no mention of any sort of cold. The woman's body was halfway out the window for several minutes. We're told there was blood everywhere. When she got back in, no frozen blood, not a frozen body. Well below zero at a 500-mile-an-hour wind chill. One would think would be extreme cold, but with no mention of any cold, the only conclusion could be that there's a rather warm atmosphere. Any wind at 500 miles an hour, you would think, would be experienced as to some degree cold and make a body cold. But with no mention of any sort, one wonders how this could possibly be if the troposphere is so cold. The only conclusion is the troposphere is simply not cold. It is hot. So here in this story, we see that the woman was being worked on, presumably because they pulled her back in. So presumably this is what they're talking about. There's no mention of cold body, or frozen blood or anything. Certainly anywhere, the plane descended from 32,000 to 10,000 feet. Anywhere in there at 500 mile an hour winds, wind chills at certainly below zero for most of the time, probably well below at first. She should have been frozen. No mention of that. And then scroll down a little more. Here we see the passenger saying we could feel the air from the outside coming in. And then we had smoke kind of coming in the window, quote unquote. So they mention even air coming in, and even that there's some smokiness. So they're paying attention to some specific details. They can feel the air, but no mention of the air was very cold. And if it's moving around, it has the effect of wind. And as somebody from Michigan like myself knows, air that's below zero moving around feels a whole lot different than air that's below zero that's not moving around. You can't really stand it. That's why we have wind chill warnings and wind chill advisories and closed schools and so forth. As soon as the temperature goes below 5, really, and there's any notable wind of 10 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour or more. So it's clear there was no cold air. And there should have been a report of cold air. Here's another story, NBC, Philadelphia. We see a comment here from a passenger 3 rows behind. He says the plane dropped immediately. Now the other story that we had up said that the plane dropped over 5 minutes. So did it drop a lot at first or not much? We don't know. All we know it was between 32,000 and 10,000 feet while the woman was halfway out the window. Probably, it sounds like she was out the window longer than that. The other story made it sound like a long time she was. Regardless, this is on a cold April day in the Midwest. People are dressed relatively like winter, so it's going to be very cold up there. I don't know the relationship between the ground temperature and temperature at 10,000 to 32,000 feet. I do, however, know that in Albuquerque, where I used to live, the mountain temperature of Sandia Peak at a mile higher than the city in the valley was directly related. They would correlate together. So does 32,000 feet correlate in the same way? I would not know. But regardless, what we do know is that at 500 miles an hour on a cold day like that, we should have an extremely cold situation. But look, the person here, Matt Tranchen, sitting 3 rows behind, says, not the plane was cold, not there was cold air. He says the plane smelled like smoke. So the air from the outside is clearly coming in, because if you look at the engine looks like it blew up. So the plane must have been smoking tremendously. So now we have multiple news stories commenting on the smell of smoke, and therefore air coming in from the outside. But it is the smoke smell that is commented on, never the cold. Should be tremendously cold air blowing around, making the cabin probably 0 degrees after some time. The other story talked about how people were trying to plug the hole up, weren't able to, so for a long time the air would have been circulating back and forth from the outside to the inside. And there would have been some sort of a temperature drop and probably some concern over how cold the plane would become. Because the next story we're going to see, we're going to hear about a cockpit that had a window break. This isn't verifiable by anyone except one person, the pilot. And they say immediately the plane fell to the cockpit fell to negative 40 Celsius. But no mention here. The Somali plane also had no mention of a temperature change. But that was in the summer in Somalia at 10,000 feet, so it would probably feel like summer at that level. So to repeat, that story is not included in this analysis because it would have no relevant data, unlike this story on a cold Midwestern day. And if we keep looking down in the story, we're told that this poor woman's blood was splattered all over the plane. It says it right there. No mention of it being frozen. Not sure if that would be a relevant detail, but I think it would be. Likely mentioned somewhere. People would make note of that, along with other stories about the cold, which is never mentioned anywhere. And here's another article from People magazine. This is a peculiar article. I was looking for articles that mentioned cold air surrounding this story. And this article popped up. And you notice here right at the beginning, it has a different altitude. It says 35,000 feet. Now, probably people just has this wrong, but it shows you how careless the media gets. They're over 3,000 feet off from what the other stories say. Now, if you scroll down, this article sort of is about people and their feelings and so forth, about how they felt that day in the plane and so forth. And we see this quote here from a person that was on the plane who was sitting right near the woman who was killed by being halfway out the window. And here's the statement that the People magazine says this person apparently gave. It's kind of like a superstitious sounding strange statement. Jennifer and I gave each other one of those looks. Oh, good sorts of looks, just kind of joking like it's going to be one of those flights. Mackay, an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, tells People, recalling the turbulence of that morning, but it didn't feel right that day. So there's really no informational content in there. I think she's trying to say that she could intuit that something was going to happen, or she had a bad feeling or something. I think that's what she's trying to say. So that's sort of the tone of this article. Because then if we scroll down slightly, we see this statement from the same person. It was very cold. As soon as I heard it, I turned immediately to my seatmate because I knew it was someplace very close to us because I could feel the cold. Meke says of the explosion, it all happened simultaneously and Jennifer was pulled out. I didn't know what this meant. At first, I didn't think she was talking about the temperature of the air. Like she was still in this sort of superstitious mode and talking about, oh, it was a cold time or something. But assuming she is talking about the temperature, cold is not the word we would expect to hear. We would expect to hear utterly frigid, bitter, frigid cold, something like that. Not cold. Cold is when you're sitting at 76.5 degrees in your comfortable chair in the plane and all of a sudden it's 50, 40, or something like that. Not 500 miles an hour going past a window of below zero air, possibly below zero in the negative 70 or 80. That's not cold. That's deathly frigid. So I didn't understand this, and I thought it almost supported the idea that cold means actually warm, means not negative 75 in wind. Even if it was, for example, 55 or 65 degrees. At 500 miles an hour, winds may be experienced as chilly or cold. She says very cold. So there's a question here if very cold is because of wind causing air to feel colder than it is, such as a wind chill factor, or if the air was very cold. Then what is very cold when it's blowing 500 miles an hour through a window? Because the above footage we've seen of water flowing across a window freely at cruising altitude across the Rocky Mountains implies very cold isn't that cold. It may be experienced as an abrupt temperature change and therefore be perceived as, quote, very cold. But if the temperature indications over the Rocky Mountains in the aforementioned video footage we saw is any indication, very cold is not too cold, just a temperature shift, possibly much due to the experience of wind. Then if we look down a little further, we again hear from this person that was 2 seats over in the aisle. Then we find this paragraph. Once Mackie realized that she too could feel the suction pulling her to the window from the aisle seat, then she concentrated on protecting the young girl seated between her and the woman who was pulled out. Now, she can feel the suction. That means she can feel the air. There is wind. And that wind is going to be somewhere between, it's going to be below zero. I don't know how it works if she's feeling the wind, the air from in the plane going out, or how it works. But presumably she's going to feel some of that negative 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 degree air. And it's going to be like something she's never felt before, frostbite in a couple minutes kind of thing, if that. No mention. Instead, she's concentrating on not keeping the little girl warm or anything, only making sure she doesn't get pulled out also. I guess just strange that, again, the cold she referred to is never mentioned again. I guess it wasn't that cold that it wasn't memorable enough to bring up again. If we scroll down again, we find discussion of when the woman was pulled back in and CPR was done on the woman for 10 minutes. No mention that they had to move her because it was so incredibly cold and this incredibly cold air was coming in. At that point, they were probably under 10,000 feet. So let's assume the temperature was above zero and a couple 100-mile-an-hour wind going past the window. No mention still of any discomfort by cold or the woman's body being frozen or anything. Which, shouldn't we expect that? At the very least, her body frozen, or showing some extreme damage from the cold. 500-mile-an-hour winds of extreme below zero. I found one other article of this same person talking about the cold air in the very same fashion, brought up once, then not brought up again. Other than that, I found nothing mentioning air temperature anywhere on the internet regarding this story. And there's no mention anywhere of the cold air or frigid air or deathly bitter cold, because it wasn't cold. We have to be honest, empirical researchers, and believe what our senses tell us to give us the right information about the world, not what theories from people tell us. Theories from people tell us that it's negative 50, negative 70 degrees up there when this event happened. But our observation tells us quite the opposite. It's quite warm up there. And if it is, planes do not lose their altitude because of temperature change. That theory is thrown away, and we can conclude that planes lose their altitude because they are traveling across an embowed zetetic plane, which was very strongly empirically verified in Zeteticism Volume 5 by looking at sunset patterns on oceans, which clearly show a cylindrically curved zetetic embowment where the flat Earth is a structure that looks roughly something like this. Here's a situation of a Chinese airplane where the pilot's window was broken at 32,000 feet. So again, definitely in the range where we would expect to have those extreme cold atmospheric temperatures. It does not say here that the pilot had a thermometer in the cockpit that gave him this reading of negative 40 Celsius. We're not told exactly how this number was known and how long he endured this temperature, because if he's going to have 500-mile-an-hour wind coming at him in that little room at negative 40 degrees Celsius with no winter coat on or not properly dressed, which is going to be dressed like you're in the middle of the coldest of Alaska, presumably he would have had frostbite damage and so forth. But we're kind of just told, oh, it was negative 40, and then the story moves on. Negative 40 Celsius. This is very strange. I don't know what's going on with this story. Something very strange about this story. It makes no sense. Okay, because that wind's coming straight in through the window. Not like the other stories we just saw where the wind can pass by. Probably to a significant degree, just passes by. Of course, we're told there was smoke, smell, and so forth, so air was getting in, of course. But this is a different scenario. This is head on. And this guy's in serious wind, 100. It has to be the case that where he's standing in the cockpit, sitting, whatnot, that wind is multiple 100 miles an hour. He should be getting smashed around, thrown around if he doesn't have a seatbelt on. Even if he does, any loose part of his body should be flailing around uncontrollably. He should be also dead like the woman who was halfway out the window on the Southwest flight. But instead, we're just told, oh, no big deal. Negative 40 Celsius coming right at him, presumably for a long time. 32,000 feet is going to take him a good 15, 30 minutes to get down. So for some long period of time, he's in these extreme winds. Long period of time meaning 1 minute, 5 minutes. 1 second could kill him because it could slam his body around and so forth. 500-mile-an-hour winds are like the most savage tornado you can imagine, all coming through a window into a little room. And clearly he's flying around in the room because he's out halfway out the window, supposedly, we're told, with 500-mile-an-hour winds coming right at him. The other woman is killed, but this guy is okay. How is that possible? We're told he has little scratches. Where's the glass, the broken glass? Did that damage them? News stories really just focus on what a great hero the pilot was. None of these details are addressed. What about the sound? 500 miles an hour or more of wind going through that window and slamming against inner parts of the cockpit. That little area with echoing going on would have been unfathomably loud. You'd think 100 decibels plus. Just a screaming air current. Lots of questions about this story. The locked cockpit is almost a way of saying unverifiable situation. You know, the other stories, we've got video, testimonies. Testimony is not empirical evidence. Video is a perhaps lowest quality of empirical evidence. But they corroborate our video footage that I've shown of the water streaming across the window. That there's not cold air outside of your airplane at 32,000 feet. The average person will want to believe this story because of the one testimony and the why would this person be lying effect that people often fall into the spell of. But the fact is that news stories often contain errors. Who knows? Doesn't matter at this moment exactly why they get there. It's all that's known is that they are there. Examples are very readily available. And it's a much better theory to conclude that there's some sort of mistaken information. There are many objections people can pose to the points of this video, which empirically verify the very warm upper atmosphere and troposphere. One is somebody could say that the liquid seen is de-icer. However, the de-icer, there are virtually no stories anywhere on the internet I could find about mid-flight de-icing. And three, with airplane wind currents, it's very difficult to believe that de-icer could be uniformly and directly placed in certain areas to do any kind of de-icing of a plane, especially since the water flows in streams according to wind currents here. Or if this was de-icer, it would only de-ice in specific locations. Another problem is that there's very little moisture supposedly up in the atmosphere. One can look up stats where it is told that if we're standing on top of Mount Everest, purportedly 90% of the Earth's atmosphere is below us, and the atmosphere planes flying is very thin. Therefore, why would there be any water up there? Which leads to a further point that not only does the troposphere seem warm, but it also seems to be watery, as if there's water above our heads, much more than we would previously have guessed. There are many mysteries that exist surrounding observations people have on airline flights, but which are simply not discussed or not noticed. I made 2 videos previously about the fact that it was stars dim as one flies over mountains during the night in a plane, which is absolutely impossible on the heliocentric Big Bang cosmology models that professional academia purports to the world by theoretical analysis. The facts are simple that some evidence of some sort would be readily available for the ultra cold temperatures. Some bit of evidence that could be directly empirically verified by a person in a plane. Frost forming on windows. At least somebody saying the plane got very cold when the windows broke at 32,000 feet. And not just the testimony of one cockpit pilot in a sealed compartment as compared to an entire plane full of people where the Wells Fargo bank employee from Albuquerque was killed, which was discussed a moment ago. Somehow, somewhere there would exist some evidence, but instead what do we have? very substantial, directly empirical counter evidence which shows that the upper atmosphere into the troposphere is quite warm. This is profound evidence for the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model of flat or Zetetic Earth. The Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model is the only model that can explain things such as star trail patterns, flag trees in the southern hemisphere, ocean currents, and a whole host of other things. But the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model has not been adopted by the flat earth community for two reasons. One, it's quite technical, and two, it is a flat earth zetetic model that involves motion. The flat earth plane is in motion. It does not move on its foundations, but the entire system it is enclosed in, the entire gyroscope that it rotates in, does have motion, which the star trail maps directly empirically verify that there should be motion among the zetetic plane. However, to disregard the model just because one intuits there should not be motion or that the motion can be felt is not empirically sound. It's very likely that the continuous motion would simply not be felt in any way except the ways in which it is verifiable, such as with wind patterns, ocean currents, and with what is called gravity, but which is actually centrifugal force. The Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model is also by far the one most in accord with the Bible. For example, numerous passages talk about people which are on the surface of the earth existing in the earth. Situations, circumstances happening in the earth when clearly the surface of the earth is being referred to. That's because in some sort of embodied plane, it makes a lot of sense to refer to something being in it, like one is in a bowl. The author of this video hesitates to use the word bowl due to the fact that it could lead the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model for flat earth to being compared to various hollow earth models or concave earth models. But the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model is simply not such. It is merely the inner part of a spherical surface to such a degree that it is only best described as an embowment, or casually put, is a bent or curved flat surface that does not necessarily represent a bowl, but where it would make sense to refer to things being inside of it, since things are inside of the curved, embowed plane, zetetic earth surface. There are many more things that could be said about the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model, many of which have been said in volumes 1 through 5 and which will be said in future volumes that will be created. But all points arguing for the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model will be strictly empirical, and it will be shown are in complete accord with the Bible, which states that the earth does not move on its foundations. But the Bible does not state that the earth does not move, period. Because it's well known the earth does move, such as with earthquakes. It just does not shake on its foundations. The reason the Zetetic Eye Gyroscope model is so important and that its empirical verification is so important is because we need to verify the model of reality that exists in Hebrew cosmology in order that we can have empirical verification that is absolutely rock solid for the evidence of God's handiwork in the skies, as it says in Psalm 19:1.